our next guest.
Great. So Senator Wiener just laid out such a fantastic overview of our state's housing situation. I mean, I just took a 10-week course in housing and transportation planning, and that was like a 30-minute crash course. So I'm really excited that he's established a really strong context for us to understand this issue. And now we'll get to hear from Kelsey Brewer, who is working on the ground on affordable housing development and is going to offer such valuable insight to us, I'm sure. So I'm thrilled to welcome Kelsey. She currently serves as the Government Affairs and Policy Director for the Jamboree Housing Corporation, which is one of the leading nonprofit housing developers in the state of California. She is an expert on transportation planning, affordable housing, obviously homelessness policy, and so much more. She has worked at the state level to pass the Orange County Financial Trust Bill, which funds housing for homeless and low-income people. For her work on passing this bill, she was listed number 11 in the Orange County Register's 100 Most Influential People. She has many other professional accolades and just has done tremendous work helping the communities that she's a part of, from her time as a student to now. I would love to go into them, but I think the best thing we can do now is just hear what she has to say and hear how she can add to this illustration that Senator Wiener started for us. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much. I'm turning bright red from that lovely introduction. So I have a really quick PowerPoint because I am a firm believer that context leads to better conversations. But when I talked with Alex and some of the other board members, what I really wanted to do is answer your questions about housing in Orange County locally, because I think the senator did a really great job of, again, painting the really dire situation that we're in as a state. But the situation here in Orange County, it has its own flavors and its own nuances. But I just want to start by saying that the type of housing that I'm going to talk about today and that I'm going to say that you all should be advocates for is not shelter. We need to advocate for housing that is more than shelter, because shelter is not permanent. It does not actually solve any of our problems. It's a Band-Aid solution. So I just want us to all have in our heads that we're talking about housing here, not shelters. But Alex, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I work for Jamboree Housing Corporation as their Director of Government Affairs and Policy. And Jamboree is one of the largest nonprofits in the state of California. We're going really ahead here, Alex. Is one of the largest developers of affordable and supportive housing in the state of California. And we believe that, our job is to deliver high quality, affordable housing and services that transform lives and strengthens communities. And I think that really speaks to what the senator is talking about as housing as kind of this all-encompassing thing. It touches climate, it touches education, it touches health policy. And we believe that when built correctly and serviced correctly, it has the potential to really transform our communities. And our vision is that every single person in the state of California, especially every single child, will live in a strong, healthy, and I want to emphasize sustainable community. Jamboree is really a leader in green infrastructure. And so we're building our housing to last for decades, and we're building the infrastructure that recognizes how important that is. So Alex, we can go to the next slide. Statewide, we have about 18,000 residents. Over 800 of our residents are veterans. That's a combination of just veterans that live in our affordable housing, but then we also have some specific units that are set aside to support homeless veterans. And so some of that population comes there. And then we have about 2,100 seniors that live in deed-restricted, age-restricted, affordable housing units throughout the state of California. Alex, you can go ahead and go to the next one. So when I say affordable housing, what does that mean? Because as we heard, there's lots of different ways that we can talk about affordable housing. But what I'm going to talk about, and what oftentimes you're going to hear your cities talk about, is a very specific type of affordable housing. And affordable housing is considered affordable if no more than 30% of your monthly income is spent on housing. And most affordable housing that's built in communities and approved by cities is going to serve people making between 30 to 60% of the area median income. And I have a couple slides later on that is actually going to show you what those numbers look like. And this is the type of housing that's going to serve working families, it's going to serve seniors, And it really is about the fact that these folks, if the market was producing housing at the rate that it needed to, would be taken care of. They don't really have a whole lot of extenuating circumstances other than they live in California and it's really expensive to live here. You can go ahead and go to the next one, Alex. And then there's kind of a subset of affordable housing that we refer to as supportive housing. And that is most associated with homelessness and chronic homelessness. And so this is the same exact type of structure. As you can see, this is one of our supportive housing developments in the city of Anaheim. It looks just like a regular apartment building. But what goes on inside this building is really, really intensive wraparound services that are focused on stabilizing any of our residents, whether that is mental health needs, whether that's addiction, whether that's jobs, anything like that, and really breaking down the barriers to why they weren't receiving services before. And what we have found, not only nationally, but in Jamboree's specific portfolio, we have a 99% retention rate, which means that when somebody comes off the street and into one of our housing units, 99% of the time, they're still with us 5 years later, housed and not on the streets. And I also want to emphasize supportive housing, though it serves homeless folks, is not shelter. It is a home. Somebody lives there. They've signed a lease just like anybody else would. It is not walk up. People can't show up off the street and receive services there. So it really is just housing with really, really intense and targeted services so that people can succeed and thrive. Next one, Alex. This is affordable housing. Normally, if I was in person, I would do like this big Vanna White move for you guys because I am so in love with Jamboree's properties and what we build because I think they're absolutely gorgeous. And I chose kind of these different pictures because I think it kind of shows, again, what the senator was talking about of how this can all look different. You know, you've got these podium style housing over here on the left that's got 3 to 4 units. But then we also have in the bottom right corner, Collage that's in Laguna Beach, which is a combination of 1 and 2 story walk-up apartments that blends in with the historical like Beach Boulevard. And so I think that this really just breaks down the myth that when we're talking about affordable housing, it's these big, ugly, tall cinder block vaults that no one wants to go into. No, like I want to live here. Like, trust me, I want to live here. We can go to the next slide. So now that we kind of all know what we're talking about, I want to get into some of the technical policy side that governs housing. And this year, it's probably something that you're going to hear about a lot. So that's why Alex and the rest of the team thought it was good for me to maybe walk through RHNA, which stands for the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. That's a fancy law that the state of California passed back in the 60s that said, hey, every 6-ish years, all these different regions in the state of California are going to have to plan for housing. And we're going to come up with numbers that they should target and hit, and then we'll give them goals all throughout the state. And that's basically what RHNA is. But the next slide kind of shows you how that process works. So as California has grown and as data collection has gotten more sophisticated, the RHNA process has also evolved with it. So now there's lots of folks that are employed running very sophisticated models to try to figure out how much housing does California need. So up at the top, you'll kind of see all of the different equations that go into that final number of like how many households are we going to have in the state of California that need housing. And then we look at a bunch of different pieces like vacancy rates. In case you were wondering, Laguna Beach, you have an incredibly low vacancy rate. Almost all of your housing is filled, which is great for everybody that has housing, but not so great for people that need housing. Then there's also the factor of looking at overcrowding. If you look in Santa Ana, it is the 5th densest city in America. And not a lot of people would think that. You would think like Chicago, New York, even San Francisco. It's Santa Ana. And that's not because we've built it to be a dense city. It's because people literally can't afford to live in any other way than in an overcrowded situation. And then, as the senator mentioned, every year we're losing housing. So how many of those units are being replaced? So all of that goes into this big fancy equation, and then it spits out a number that says, here is the amount of housing that you need to build. And on the next slide, I have a breakdown of what those numbers look like for the region that Orange County is in. So we are part of SCAG. So far, if you're following, we have RENA, we have SCAG. So these are two separate things. I know they get confusing. It's a little bit alphabet soup, but just follow with me. And that includes the counties of Imperial, LA, Orange, Riverside, San Bernardino, and Ventura. And together, that calculation spit out the number of about 1.3 million homes. So all of those counties in the next 6 to 8 years need to build 1.3 million homes. And as you can see right here, the third line, Orange, is 183,000. And it depends on a lot of different pieces, what the individual allocations are. But Laguna Beach has a sizable amount, along with Huntington and Costa Mesa and lots of different folks. No one really got away easy in this one. And as you can also see, of the 183,000 homes, SCAG also goes one step further and says, here's what you need to zone for very low income, moderate, and above income. And if you're wondering how we calculate that, remember we talked earlier about AMIs, area median income. All of those categories are tied to an area median income number. So very low income is anything below 30%, low income is anything below 50%, and moderate is technically anything below 60%, but we can sometimes get it up to 80% depending on the funding source. So that's a lot of housing. I'm not gonna lie, that's a lot of housing. So Alex, can we go to the next slide? What I want to talk a little bit about before answering some of your questions is how we can take that number and actually turn it into a reality in ways that make sense for the communities that we all love and cherish. So Senator Wiener already did a great job of talking about a lot of the barriers to housing production. You have cost of land. Average acre of land in Orange County is $4 million. If you go to San Francisco, it goes up to $10 million. We also have a lack of funding. The state has done an okay job of backfilling it, but between 2008 and 2016, $3.2 billion were lost out of the housing development system in the state of California. And then there's also administrative burdens. We've talked about CEQA already, we've talked about zoning, but one of the things that I always like to point out is also redlining. For those who maybe aren't aware, redlining is a historical, in theory, way that we discriminatorily zoned poor people and people of color into certain areas of town and left other areas of town to be, wealthier and whiter. And actually, if you look at old redlining maps in the state of California and you overlay them with cities' current zoning maps, you'll see that the places where you allow single family homes, what the senator was talking about earlier, nearly perfectly overlaps with what was considered the white and wealthy areas. And the places where we allow apartments and low income housing, like what's on the screen, to be built, almost perfectly matches up where we told poor Black and brown people to live for decades. And so I also come at housing very much from a social justice perspective and a restorative justice perspective. Housing is social justice, and access to housing has to be equitable. And then lastly, a lack of political will and NIMBYism. The senator kind of talked about that from the city perspective. But one of the things that I try to do in my job is a lot of education, because I believe that I don't think anyone wants to be exclusionary. I don't think they want to come across that way, but I think a lot of it comes from fear and maybe not understanding what kind of housing we're talking about. And so I do a lot of education to combat NIMBYism, but it's a really big deal. And for those that don't know, NIMBYism stands for not in my backyard. Alex, next slide. And then I just want to cut to the chase of why. Why do we care about affordable housing? First and foremost is the housing market's super inefficient, so we have to. The market is not building the type of housing necessary to support working people in the state of California, so we need subsidized housing, like the housing that Jamboree builds, to fill in that gap. Third, there's a jobs home nexus that's incredibly mismatched. I grew up in Bakersfield. You can cry for me after this meeting. But I had friends growing up whose parents woke up at 5 a.m. to drive over the grapevine to go to work in LA County because that's where the jobs were, but they could only afford a home in the Central Valley, which automatically leads to the next one. If we do not solve the jobs home mismatch, we will not meet our climate goal changes. ACARB found that 40% of California's greenhouse gas emissions are linked to transportation. And the number one driver of transportation is people needing to get to their jobs in places that they can't afford to live. So if we care about the environment, we have to care about housing too. And then last one, this one isn't a fact, but I'm going to make a really compelling argument for it. I think housing is a silver bullet. I think it touches education, health, public safety, economic development, traffic. If you hate sitting in traffic, it would be a lot less terrible if people didn't have to sit on the freeway for 45 minutes to get to their jobs. Housing is the silver bullet for addressing all of those different issues that I think as Democrats we care about. So that is my argument for why you should care about affordable housing. But I also think it's important to talk about who, because I think it helps us to picture maybe our neighbors or our sons and our daughters, or the kids that used to babysit for us or whatever. Who is it that we're trying to help? So this is actually all Orange County specific information. As you can see, the average 2-bedroom apartment in Orange County is about a little over $2,100 or almost $2,200. It's a lot worse if you go into specific zip code data, but let's just go ahead and take that average. In order for a family of 4 to be able to, in order for a renter to be able to afford that median renter price and still only spend 30% of their income on housing, you've got to be making $42 an hour, right? So as you can see, a lot of these things that all of us depend on for our jobs, just our day-to-day functions, whether it's the people that take care of our kids, the people that are helping us with our aging parents, the people that are helping us exchange their genes, all of those different things are people that cannot afford to live here. So then I'm often asked the question of, okay, well, why should I care? Like, obviously they're figuring it out, right? If you're having to make up these massive gaps every single month, you are on the precipice of disaster every single month. One of the things that I am most terrified about is at the end of June, our moratorium eviction ends in the state of California, and we're going to have a lot of people that fall into homelessness because of that. So I argue that it's a lot easier for us to build the kind of housing that our workforce needs than to deal with them once they have been on the street for 2 or 3 years and have developed other issues that we now have to address through a much more aggressive model of housing. And then numbers, if you're not a visual person, that's what's for the left is, on the right are for my analytical number people. So we can serve up to at Jamboree people that are making 80% of the area median income. So the area median income for a family of 4 is in Orange County is $97,000. And I like to point that out because I think on this call, you know at least a few people that make less than $97,000. That means that the kind of housing we're talking about serves them. So if I am, if I'm looking at serving somebody that's making 80% of the area median income, that's $72,000. That's our nurses, that's our firefighters. That is so many pieces. And so I think those numbers really put into context for everybody, like who it is that we're talking about. It's not, kind of the stereotype that we have in our head of people that aren't working, of people that are looking for a handout. These are people that are absolutely working, but can't figure out how to make that gap. And I don't know how to fix that math. Maybe I'll ask Katie Porter next time I see her, but I don't know how to fix that math. Alex, next slide. So this is my final takeaway because I'm with my Dems, so I can be a little bit more political than when I presenting to the Republicans. But my kind of final takeaway, if you take nothing away from what the senator said, what I've said, what you thought about housing, is I just really hope that as a community, we can learn how to not just say no to housing and really think about yes, and this is how, and this is where. And recognizing that by choosing to do nothing or by saying it's this city's problem or that city's problem, I just really want to affirm to you that that is not a morally neutral choice. Like, you are making a decision that has impacts to low-income people, people of color, immigrant communities, the queer community, women, single moms, pretty much all of the things that we care about, that's touched by housing. So that would be what I would hope that you take away from this, that we can definitely have all the kinds of debates on design standards and all of that, but we can't debate whether or not people need a place to live, because we're better than that. So Alex, question.
That was fantastic, Kelsey. Thank you so much. Okay, so Alex is going to take a couple questions from the chat.
I'll just start with a question. So what should we do as citizens to encourage our city council to act on housing? And I think we have 2 city council members here. So what should they do to take the lead on housing?
Hello, city council members. I don't have my Jamboree hat on, so please don't get me in trouble. But what I would say is that your city council members, just like the senator said, are trying to do their best. But when you are sitting in a city council hearing at 10 o'clock at night and you are on your 81st speaker who is screaming at you that you are ruining their life and their livelihood and you're going to bring X, Y, and Z people into that, I can understand why it's really, really hard to stand up for housing when there's nobody else there. So one of the things that Jamboree has begun working on with the Orange County United Way is our Housing Champions program. And it's a pilot program right now that we're eventually hoping to roll out to the 34 cities in Orange County, so that people like hopefully all of you on this call that care about housing understand how it's an intersectional solution to a lot of our social issues, can get a ping on your cell phone or your email saying, X, Y, and Z is before the city council tonight. If you're able to send in a letter of support, show up to city council meetings. And then the other thing I would say is, if what I've said to you in terms of like RENA or housing allocations, if that all sounds new to you, I'm going to put Alex on the spot here, but I think Alex would be willing to talk to you about like a housing element process that's going on here in Laguna Beach. And that is one of the best ways that you can plug in, because the housing elements that the cities in our region are creating this year is going to dictate how hard my job is for the next 6 to 8 years. So if you all could participate and make my job a little bit easier, that would be very appreciated. But really, it goes back to what the senator said. Tell us where, tell us how, and then let us build the housing.
So can you speak more on your work with green infrastructure and the intersection of climate change and housing, not just in terms of the transportation impacts, but with the building materials and energy use?
Yeah, so California, I'll go really, really technical and then a little bit anecdotal. But so on the super, super technical side, California is a leader in green building standards. If you want to see what those standards are, it's called Cal Green Title 24 standards, which is great. Those are awesome. It has things like water reclaim, drought tolerance, making sure that you're using the right type of insulation to decrease energy use, all of those different pieces. But Jamboree believes that baseline isn't excellence, and we are always about excellence. And so we design all of our new construction developments to a minimum LEED standard, which comes with a whole different host of requirements that we have to do. But if I could speak a little bit about the transportation piece, because I really just want to emphasize the data is really, really clear to us that even if we do everything else perfect, even if every single home that is built has, solar panels, even if every single person in Orange County is given a Tesla and switches over tomorrow, we're not going to get there without building housing. And so that's why I focus really, really heavily on the production side and that connection between transportation and housing, because it's kind of like one of those things where if we don't address it, everything else we do doesn't matter. But one of the things that I can do, Alex, after you guys move into the next part of your agenda, is drop some links in the chat for folks that want to dig a little bit more into like the technical production kind of side of it, of the materials we're using, so they can explore it a little bit more.
Great. And then for the final question, can you just sort of inspire us a little bit? Can you tell us about a project that was maybe near low-wage earners? Maybe they were teachers or they worked at grocery stores. And can you maybe talk about how that changed their lives?
Yeah, I almost put this picture in the PowerPoint and now I'm hitting myself that I didn't, but we opened up a project in Fullerton in late 2019 that had taken us 10 years to do. And that was a combination of, we brought it to city council, the neighbors freaked out, so then we had to wait a couple years, come back with a different plan, deal with this, then redevelopment's gone. Now we have to go figure out new funding, et cetera, et cetera. Everything that could go wrong with this project pretty much went wrong. And you'll find that a lot of our projects are the ugly stepchildren of development. Like, they take a while, but they're beautiful when they're done. And Compass Rose was in a neighborhood in Fullerton that had been particularly plagued by a very, very lethal combination of gang violence and over-policing. And it was couple blocks away from where Kelly Thomas was murdered by Fullerton police officers. Like, it was a tough neighborhood. And I'll never forget pulling up, because we had just been the top, that's when we like all the roofs and we have a little party. And we always have to put up certain signs so that people know it's affordable housing and they know that they can apply. And I was there the day that the first rounds of residents were going to move in. And I was there to do a resident interview so we could hear about exactly what you're asking me. What's your testimony? How did you end up here? And so I ended up meeting up with this African-American woman and her 10-year-old daughter. And they had just gotten their keys. And so I was following them to their apartment. I was going to get pictures of them going into their apartment for the first time. And the little girl got to the door, and I knew it was going to be emotional, but I had a vision in my head for like why. And, you know, Jamboree, really, we try to pay attention to the little touches. And in this case, the little touch of this apartment home was that every single one of them had a doorbell. And the little girl started crying because it was the first time she'd ever had a doorbell in her entire life. And she said, I get to tell people I'm home, or people get to tell me that they're at my home. And so I think about that little girl a lot when I have had particularly challenging days at work, because I come at housing from a very social justice perspective. And I just think that every child and every family deserves to have a home. And I think that we have the ability to do that. So that's my inspiration, is that we can do it. It's a fixable problem.
Thank you so much for all that you do, and for sharing all your wisdom with us. I know that I think this has really made an impact on all of us. Thank you so much, Kelsey.
I love to be able to just talk about housing. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Kelsey, thank you so much. I hear what Alex said. Absolutely fantastic. I think you've moved us all. You've given us a lot of a great perspective, and the social justice piece is so important, and also the environmental. So thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. It won't be the last time you hear from us. And we look